We meet at a crucial time in the history of our alliance. The world faces many dangerous and evolving threats, and it is absolutely clear that NATO is as vital to our future as it has been in our past. Russian troops are illegally in Ukraine. The extremist Islamist threat has risen in a new form in Iraq and Syria. These are just two of the threats that we face. NATO is the anchor of our security, and over the next 2 days, we must reinvigorate and refocus this alliance to tackle new threats and to ensure it continues to foster stability around the world.
There is now little doubt the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has failed yet again in its mission of protecting member states and those affected by the actions of aggressive dictators. While Ukraine is not part of NATO, the effects of Russian interference in that country have already rippled across Europe and most of the world. Yet NATO sits and talks some more. Those in the Ukraine wait to see if there's more to see here than just jibber-jabber. Welcome back to MidPoint, the editor and co-founder of Blue Force Tracker, a website comprised of journalists and veterans of the military, intelligence corps, and diplomatic corps. And speaking to us today from the Ukraine, Nolan Peterson. Nolan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Nolan, I wanted to point out that you were scheduled to join us via Skype today, yet you are now on telephone because, as I understand, within the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, you've heard gunfire of sorts?
That's correct. Internet has been pretty spotty lately. This afternoon, we started hearing some rumblings from the east, which is toward the direction of the Ukraine-Russia border. And there's a town to the east called Novozovsk, where the rebels are entrenched with up to 67 tanks, according to some people, some civilians who've called in from Novozovsk. So this afternoon, we started hearing some rumblings of what we thought was probably artillery fire. Found out that it was a rebel tank column moving toward Mariupol, which is the city I'm in right now. The Ukrainian army was able to turn back the tank column, and we thought that perhaps there would be a lull in the fighting, but just a few hours later, we started hearing the sounds of artillery again. So back on and listening to your segment leading up, pitching the summit going on right now. It sounds like there's a sharp disconnect between the reality on the ground and what we're hearing from Moscow and what we're hearing from the NATO summit.
Is it fair to say also that there would be a disconnect in what is being said in NATO? Because while people such as the British Prime Minister were talking about taking steps, the President points to it and so many others, I would imagine that you and the people on the ground see no steps being taken, and see nothing that actually is being done of substantive value.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll tell you, the Ukrainian troops here are certainly not giving a whole lot of value to the talks of a ceasefire. I went out and visited the Mariupol airport today, where the Ukrainian army has been building trenches. I mean, we're talking about World War I style trenches here to defend a tank attack. On the outskirts of the city, we've got civilians also helping to dig trenches. They're putting up artillery pieces, anti-aircraft artillery pieces around the city as well. Yeah, they're really digging in for what they think is going to be a World War II style invasion of the city. So while leaders are all talking about ceasefires and negotiations, it seems like things are actually escalating here.
When you talk about a World War II style invasion of the city, how far would you say you are from what would be considered the front lines, and what have you been able to see as far as any sort of advance, or who actually is gaining any sort of advantage here?
Right. Well, in Novozovsk, which is the closest rebel-controlled city, it's about 45 kilometers east of here. However, today, according to the Ukrainian military, the rebels advanced within 7 kilometers, or about 4.5–5 miles of where I am in Mariupol. Now, Mariupol is a major industrial city for Ukraine. There's 500,000 people who live here. It's the largest port on the Sea of Azov as far as exporting their grain and their steel, manufactured goods. So this is a real prize for both Ukraine and the rebels, and both sides are really going to dig in and try and take this city. So that if the rebels make a go at Mariupol, it's going to be a pretty bloody fight. The Ukrainian military has set up their positions on the outskirts of this city, and there's actually very little troop presence within the city, and that's because they're trying to limit civilian casualties when the fighting began. They don't want artillery landing, hitting schools, hospitals, whatever. The rebels have a pattern that they've demonstrated of firing from civilian positions to try and create civilian casualties, much like what you saw in Gaza with Hamas. They're doing that to try and win the propaganda war. So there's a lot of anxiety here among the civilians because they know they're probably going to be caught in the crossfire, and the Ukrainian military is also very worried because in a lot of ways they are outgunned by the rebels, which speaks to the absolutely absurd notions these rebels are not supported by Russia, because these rebels have tanks and heavy weapons, Grad rockets. It's setting itself up to be a pretty serious battle.
Is there any doubt in the minds of the people that you have spoken with there, in the villages, in the surrounding areas, that as we look at what NATO is talking about right now, that in many ways, certainly NATO and perhaps even the United States has given up on the Ukraine? And I just want to point this out because the president said, while Ukraine is not a member of NATO, he sent a message to Moscow basically saying, quote, don't even think about messing around in Estonia or in any of the Baltic areas in the same way that you've been messing around in Ukraine. To some people, that sounds almost as if, here, Ukraine, take it, just don't go anyplace else. The people there have to be absolutely beside themselves, thinking that no one is there to help them, and no one wants to.
That's true. Speaking with the soldiers, I've heard from a few soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, that they say the EU, NATO, and the United States have turned their back on Ukraine. They basically have abandoned us, and that's pretty sad, because Ukraine had a revolution to essentially turn their back on Russia and try and become part of the West, to become part of Europe. And now, as they're single-handedly trying to fight off Russia, they are getting very little support from the West. I have to add, though, that among the soldiers, there is a definite reluctance and a reticence to have America or NATO directly intervene or even to supply weapons. What they're worried about happening is this war escalating, because they have no doubt that if the U.S. sends weapons, or if the U.S. or NATO intervenes in any meaningful way, that Russia will simply just up the ante, and this conflict will escalate into something much worse.
So then it almost sounds like what you're saying is that the people there would be willing to not surrender, but to be overrun by the Russians instead of getting the military support, the goods, the weapons that they would need. That seems to fly in the face of what so many people have said about the Ukraine, that we need to. America, NATO, and others need to bring weapons in there immediately.
Right. Well, what Ukraine is really looking for is not necessarily lethal weapons. What they need are night vision goggles, and they buy their uniforms off the internet. That is how defunct their military is. But they are very worried that if there's a huge influx of American weapons, that Russia will respond by sending in even more weapons. And this is an opinion that was really only shared by officers in the military who have a much more strategic view of how things are going. You talk to civilians on the street, they're begging for American help, but the officers are very wary of escalating this to a much larger degree, because they really have a very cynical, and rightfully so, cynical view of Putin, and they think that he's just going to take this thing to the max. He's not going to back down. That's really what they're worried about.
I only have about 40 seconds left. Putin has proposed a 7-step plan for peace in the Ukraine. I'm not trying to be funny here, but is it almost as if the people there who live in the Ukraine just find this as laughable as they possibly could, so darkly humorous?
Absolutely. Putin is just trying to set himself up to be some sort of a good guy in this situation, but it's so obvious that he's created a list of demands that Ukraine cannot meet. And even if Ukraine meets it, and Russia, even if they did order a ceasefire, I highly doubt that these rebels are going to obey Putin. They've got their sights set on creating their own splinter of Ukraine, and I feel like the Pandora's box has been opened, and it might be too late to reel it back in.
Got about 20 seconds left. Do you fear for your safety and your life at this time?
Not really. I think there's, like I said, the city has 500,000 people, so a large group of people, a lot of people who have a means of getting out of here. And also, there's a lot of foreign journalists here, so
do you have an escape route planned?
I'll just stay with the herd and stay out of trouble.
Do you have an escape route planned?
I do, yes. I've talked to the State Department. They know I'm here, and I'm also on ex-military, so when the little hairs stand up in the back of my neck, I know it's time to go.
Might be any time now. Nolan Peterson from Blue Force Tracker, we thank you so much for taking the time. Please be safe, and we hope to talk to you again real soon, Nolan. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Hairy times in the Ukraine and a possible bloody sight. Stay with us. We'll continue with this story and so much more right here on MidPoint, where we question everything.